Hey friends, welcome back to the Invitation Podcast. We've got
Bill here.
Kyle here. So glad you can join us for Season 3, Episode 3. We're diving into Leviticus 25 in a big way today. Got a lot of ground to cover. Phil, what did we miss in the last few episodes? Bring the good people up to speed and let us know what we're getting into today.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, we covered two stories in the book of Exodus so far in the season. One concerning being filled with the Holy Spirit, and we learned two kind of obscure characters in Bezalel and Oholiab, and we did a deep dive on what the Bible originally says about being filled with the Holy Spirit that will more than surprise you when you go back and look back at the episode, especially given how we typically use that in our current church context.
Yeah.
And then we also talked about the kingdom of priests and how the upside down, inside out version of the kingdom started well before Jesus started teaching an inside out, upside down kingdom. And it all began not only in Exodus, but we went all the way back to Genesis 1, 2, and 3 on that one and explored the topic of what this different sort of kingdom that God has always been up to looks like. And it has something to do with priests, which is another term that we kind of tore up and put back together and looked through the Bible's lens on that. But Kyle, I am really excited for today's topic in Leviticus, which there's not too many times people get really excited to dig into the book of Leviticus.
It's not one of those very quoted Bible chapters or books of the Bible, but there's some good stuff that we're going to dig into today.
There is some good stuff. And actually, now that I think about it, Leviticus was maybe the first book of the Bible that I ever publicly journaled through and started writing devotionals for. That sort of writing actually gave me the inspiration to start teaching the Bible more and more way back in the day. And part of that is the challenge. The challenge of Leviticus is that it's not a very oft quoted book. It feels very ancient and old. More than any other book in the Bible, most likely. It feels ancient. It feels cultic and weird and has all sorts of sacrifices and ordinances that we really struggle with to this day. But in it, and at the heart of it, is this topic of Jubilee. Now, Kyle, you and I will be detailing here a little bit more how this term means a lot to both of us, each of us. But if let's resonate with the listener here for a minute. If we never heard of the word Jubilee in the Bible before, what do we normally attach to the word Jubilee?
Yeah, Jubilee sounds like a good old fashioned, frolicking, it's more food and, dancing around and just a general party type, atmosphere in the, at least when I think of it, kind of an old school feast, and when you're done feasting, a whole bunch of instruments magically show up, and then everyone's out there on the dance floor showing their best moves.
Yes, yeah, there's a celebratory nature to the word, and even that almost cartoonic feeling of just things breaking into the scene of music and instruments and dancing, and it's something cartoonic about the word of or even a musical of just bursting out into song and dance and joy. Yeah, jubilation, jubilee. There was actually across the street from me in my teenage years. We lived across the street from a strip mall, and one of the shops across the street was actually called Jubilee, and it was a thrift store.
Okay.
And there's actually a little bit of relevance to
Sure.
Leviticus 25 when it comes to this. Now, I'll kind of keep that encoded here. But this topic of Jubilee for you and I, it holds special merit because of a conference that you and I went to way back in the day. I don't know what year. I forgot to ask you before we hopped on.
Yeah, I mean, that would have been, if I had to guess, that would be
05?
Yep.
20 years. That's worthy of Jubilee itself.
How about it?
Yeah. And so the ministry I work for, the CCO, the Coalition for Christian Outreach, I don't mention it too much here, but they have held this Jubilee conference for 50 years now. I want to say 45, 50 years now. And without spilling into it, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but it's a conference for college students to explore the many, many, many ways that this really important chapter of the Bible ends up playing out. We are not going to take you through a weekend's worth of conference education in less than an hour podcast, but let's do what we normally do. Let's look at the passage of scripture. We'll explore some of the invitations that we feel this passage is making. And hopefully by the end of it, we feel that you have a clear sense of what God is like, what life following after God is like, and an invitation to follow him more in that. So with that, Kyle, before we dig into any of our memories of the conference or anything else like that, why don't you read the passage for us today, which is Leviticus 25, verses 8 through 12.
All right. So usually, if you're a long-time listener of the Invitation podcast, you're familiar with Phil's tiny travel Bible, but we're bringing out the big
Ooh,
one today.
is
And
that
my favorite. Oh yeah, it's leather. Yep, my favorite translation, the New Living. So here we are, Leviticus 25, uh, verse 8. In addition, you must count off 7 Sabbath years. 7 years times 7, adding up to 49 years in all. Then, on the Day of Atonement of the 50th year, blow the trumpets loud and long throughout the land. This year will be set apart as holy, a time to proclaim release for all who live there. It will be a jubilee year for you. Then each of you returns to the land that belonged to your ancestors and rejoins your clan. Yes, the 50th year will be a jubilee for you. During that year, do not plant any seeds or store away any of the crops that grow naturally, and do not process the grapes that grow on your unpruned vines. It will be a jubilee year for you, and you must observe it as a special and holy time. You may, however, eat the produce that grows naturally in the fields that.
And that is just one small section of an entire chapter on this topic of Jubilee. Thanks for reading that, Kyle. And in this section of the podcast, I've subtitled it, Let's Come to Terms, because there's a couple terms here other than Jubilee that are new to us in our journey that we've taken here for 2+ seasons now. And the first one we need to pause on is Sabbath. We haven't talked about Sabbath. We somehow missed that in Genesis 1 and 2. We spent all of that time in Genesis 1, 2, and 3 and somehow did not explore the invitation around Sabbath. Kyle, what comes to mind when you think about Sabbath?
I'm holding back some thoughts because I do believe that we should do an entire
Oh,
episode on Sabbath. That
sure.
being said,
Yeah.
I believe, and would love to get your candid thoughts on this, but I believe that Sabbath can start with something very tiny in your life that's set aside and
Mhm.
grow and mature into something beautiful. So if you feel like you're not doing a proper Sabbath,
Mhm.
um, it's just like diet and exercise. You gotta start somewhere small and take it from there. And it is something that is truly going to serve you. And there's tons of examples as we dig into this idea of Jubilee, but essentially, this idea of Sabbath is that we're setting that aside and we're resting, we're recharging, and we're giving that back to the Lord.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, giving it back to the Lord. The Sabbath, in essence, means a rest, right? A ceasing from working, and it's typically viewed as one day a week, right? And it's commanded. It's commanded in Exodus, but even before it's commanded in Exodus, it's modeled in Genesis. And so this is where we could do, pilot an entire episode on this, but in Genesis 2, verses 2 and 3, this is what it says on Sabbath, and we won't go on and on about it, but it says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done." And so part of the reason why Sabbath is introduced to us and is commanded to us and is part of even this Jubilee thing that we are talking about here today is not so much because it's a command, but it's a reflection. It's a reflection of not only what God does, but what he is like. Because, Kyle, the entire universe was created in 6 days, which even that is just fantastic to think about. And I would be tired from creating the entire universe in 6 days. But God is limitless in his energy, in his endurance, in his creativity. You name it, in his recipes, in his ingredients, right? It's not like he ran out of steam. He just rested because that's what God wanted to do. He wanted to appreciate and enjoy the work that was completed and rest within it. And so that's where I'll hit the pause button, because that actually opens up a whole bunch of different branches of thought after that. But you can get a sense of that very same thing from the short passage that we read here, that you read for the listeners, where it's like there's supposed to be the Sabbath of Sabbaths, the 7 of 7 years, and then this giant fifth year, that the whole year is to be this enjoyment, the ceasing of working. Don't prune the grapevines, only eat what grows naturally, right? So there's this, you're going to stop working and you're going to enjoy, but not just because that's a command, but you're actually like partnering with God on what he's like and what he does. Any other thoughts on Sabbath before we go to our next term?
I'm gonna bite my tongue on that one. There's a whole lot more on Sabbath, but that's gonna be for another day.
Yeah, and you're doing a better job than I am, man. So the next term is Day of Atonement, and this is just another one of those that, man, if we wanted to spend multiple seasons in the book of Exodus, we would have definitely come to this. And Leviticus, I guess it's ordained in its reality in Leviticus. So the Day of Atonement, it's still to this day a holy day for the Jewish people. I believe it's Yom Kippur. I should have had that more organized in my notes here. But so if you see that, it's typically September or sometimes it's early October, because it's based on the lunar year. It's a holy day. It's one day set aside that the high priest, so just one person, one time a year, goes into the most holy place of the temple, things that we've just alluded to in the podcast, and atones. There's blood sacrifice and blood sprinkling, and there's all sorts of rites and rituals that are performed on this day. And the atonement is for the forgiveness of the people. There's one goat that is sacrificed. There's another goat that's chased into the wilderness, interestingly enough. And yeah, there's the entrance into the most holy place, and the coming out of the most holy place, with all these other rituals that I'm not detailing. And this Day of Atonement is a day to fast. It's a day to not work. It's a reverent day. And so it's a jubilation type day. It's a very somber day, and it's one to recognize the deep faults and failures that we all commit as individuals and as a community, and to recognize our need for forgiveness through the different rituals and through the different ceremonies, if you will. I don't mean that in a happy way, again, right? Through the ceremonial aspect of the day. And so, oh, and it's made holy. It's consecrated. This idea of consecration and holiness. I think your translation said make it holy. This is the idea of you don't think about anything else. You don't concern yourself with anything else. You would turn your iPhones off, let alone put them on do not disturb mode, right? Like, it would be this idea of fully setting aside
Yeah, I see
the
you
entirety.
airplane mode users. Nope, you got to turn it off.
completely turned off, left back at home, left underneath, left in the safe. And so, what I'll finally say about this is one way you can think about this word atonement, and we'll see how much time I have in the production room on this episode on the video. But you can think of the word atonement in 3 broken down words: at one mint. It's this becoming one with God and his love again, atonement. Kyle, any thoughts or questions on that? Anything that I left unclear? I mean, there's a lot more to the Day of Atonement, but any thoughts on that, or any insights or questions?
I really like the definition of. I read the definition here that I found was the concept of a person taking action to correct previous wrongdoing.
For the word atonement.
Right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it's good.
Yep. So this very intentional. It's not like a kind of. I'm sorry. What'd you say? As you ask a kid to say, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Can't hear you. I'm sorry." So yeah, very intentional action
That's
to
right.
correct previous wrongdoing.
Yeah, it's not just words. There's the actions, there's the showing up, the reverence, the putting aside of everything else. And so there's this sacrifice of a day, sacrifice of a goat, 2 goats, the sacrifice, the risk of the high priest going into the most holy place of God was so severe that they would tie a rope around his ankle in case he died in there, so they could
Wild.
yank him back out. So like the whole day is symbolized by sacrifice and realized with forgiveness, and it is somber and it is sober and it is consecrated, wholly set aside. And so that leads us to this concept of Jubilee, because this idea of Sabbath, of rest and enjoyment, is being combined with this somber, sober, holy idea of the Day of Atonement, and is supposed to be a a realization, right? A realization of something more for a whole year. So Kyle, just like so many other things that we have covered in the Bible so far, things are not always just what they seem on the surface, right? There's this combination of both rest and enjoyment and somber and sobriety. There's this sense of being one with God and yet needing forgiveness from God. There's this sense of having worked hard for 49 years even, but also entering into the rest that even God determines his rest to be. So this is all leading into the consequences of Jubilees. This is just table setting so far. Yeah, any thoughts on any of the table setting?
Yeah, I'm sensing a trend, and so I will kind of summarize that here in a little bit. But the whole idea certainly sets up a really nice thematic sequence like we've done in past episodes. Yeah,
Yeah.
I will sit on that.
Nice, 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 nice. Okay, well, let's dive in then to Jubilee even deeper here. And this is where I'm tempted to read the entire rest of the chapter, but you don't make podcast episodes out of reading entire chapters out of Leviticus. So what I'm going to do is do some summary work here. We already have the sense of there's like 2 streams streaming into this year of Jubilee. One is this somberness again, right? The Day of Atonement, setting aside, recognizing our need for forgiveness and making sacrifices to do so. The other side is this culmination of work that leads into rest and enjoyment and embodying God himself in the enjoyment of what he has provided. And what ends up being advocated for in the rest of the chapter is really interesting. It's really compelling, and it might not even be what you expect. I know for me, if I were to think about, okay, what would it look like for, and maybe I'll pose this to you, Kyle, too. So be thinking about this question, right? Like, what would you be thinking if there was a year set aside to celebrate forgiveness, to rest in provision? I would almost kind of see like it'd be this year-long church potluck of sorts of like, worship music, but then eating, and then no one's working. So I imagine there'd just be all sorts of various forms of entertainment, board games and movies, and just kind of this like, imagine the Ferris Bueller's Day Off for a year. I
Yeah.
don't know. Right, exactly. So anything else come into your mind as far as what you would expect for something where it was this combination of Day of Atonement and Sabbath rest?
What a weight off, right? What a resetting, what a beautiful. I think, yeah, reset is the
Hmm.
best
Yeah.
word, right? We were setting up for this podcast and my computer was giving me issues and I needed to reset the
Hmm.
browser. I needed to reset and clear the cache. What a perfect example of what we also need to do to move through life without getting bogged down.
Yeah. Yeah, and that leads really well actually into the rest of the chapter here, because what ends up happening is all sorts of things are sort of set right and set back. So it's not only this church potluck celebration, but it is kind of like a reset. It's something where it's like, hey, what's been going on for the last 49 years likely has produced a lot and likely has advanced civilization even a little bit in 9 years. There's probably lots to celebrate and lots to reflect on. And yet, a lot of the rest of this chapter is actually trying to set things right again. And so, one of the things that happens is land is returned. I think you even read a little bit about that, but there's this proclamation of liberty throughout all the land to its inhabitants. And you are to reclaim the land that is truly yours and your families. Now, land's important to this day. I mean, there's wars fought over land, and there's purchasing land, there's building houses on land, there's farming land. I mean, there's so much that centers around land. But back then, it was even more crucial to your wealth, to your well being. It was an agricultural society back then. So most everyone had some sense of gardening and animal culture, right? I mean, Jesus being born in a manger was actually still prototypical of the fact that people had mangers attached to their house where animals, were sleeping and were doing other things that animals do, eating and sleeping and going to the bathroom and all that stuff, right? So land was returned to the rightful family owners. Food was enjoyed because the Lord promised to provide freely for the food. Let's see if I can snipe some of these verses out here too. So the poor were paid special attention to in this chapter. So the poor among you would be recognized in a way where it's like, what can we do to make sure the poor don't remain poor, right? Uh, and one of the ways that this was done is if one of the ways that you would get yourself out of debt or working through debt is you would basically sell yourself into indentured servanthood, right? Into enslavement. And it wasn't how we might think about American history enslavement, but it was just, hey, I've got this debt. I don't have the money to do it, but I can give you the hours. And if it got to the year of Jubilee, those people were set free and they were returned, even if their debt wasn't paid. So not only were people set free, debts were canceled. They were just canceled. When you said it was a reset of your computer, this really was. It was like this economic reset. It was this family reset. So there might have been, cousin Joe has been working with, with cousin Hosea over there, neighbor Jeremiah way over across the way. And now he's back home, right? And his debt has been forgiven. I mean, you talk about a reset. I think the verse I was trying to look for is, I think there's a verse somewhere in there, and again, I didn't want to detail all of the many verses, but I think there's even a verse in here about taking care of the animals properly and
Mm.
returning the animals back to the people. So the fields, the grains, the fruit, the animals, and the people are all given this great reset. And Kyle, I can't help but think about Genesis 1, because you have this top down, bottom, right? Like the whole of creation is given this welcome back to its roots, but in a way that's been developed as well. And this was the call. This was the call of Genesis 1, is that people would be good stewards and they would rule well and be a blessing to each other and to the world around them. Can't help but think about Genesis 1 again. And even some of what we talked about with our episode on Noah as well, this kind of reset. But instead of a flood of violence and anti-violence like we talked about in that episode, it's a flood of forgiveness and rest. Thoughts
Mm.
on any of that, Kyle? I know I preached it a little bit more because it's hard to summarize a chapter, but what are you cooking on over there?
Well, I really like this juxtaposition of really heavy with really, uh, you know, happy and joyous. And I think that, as a society, we tend to cut out or avoid or diminish the more somber aspects of whatever. I mean, I think about a wedding, right? A lot of folks
Mm-hmm.
are foregoing a service before the nuptials and the reception, and I think this is an interesting highlight of the fact that we have the capacity, or at least we had the capacity, of holding these two very disparate things and showing how normal that is in life to experience these spans of emotions and complex ideas, the heavy mixed with the jubilant, etc. And I think that's just a juxtaposition between some biblical times and now. And I think it causes me to pay attention to some potential underlying reasons as to why that might be the case.
Yeah, yeah, that's well put. I don't know why, but I was reminded of Coach Jimmy V of the Jimmy V Foundation. If anyone's an ESPN fan out there, they know who Jimmy V is because every year they do a fundraiser for him. Well, he has since passed away from cancer, but he has left a foundation that does cancer research and cancer fundraising. And he has this very famous speech from, I think, the very first ESPYs, their like sports awards, where he says every day people should laugh, think, and cry every day. And so that juxtaposition of the deep, the jubilant, but also the weeping and the
Yeah,
recognition of the brokenness of the world. And I think Jimmy V's onto something. I think you're onto something. I think Jubilee is onto something where sometimes we just get stuck, right? Like there's definitely there's definitely theologians out there that really love to harp on, the seriousness of the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, right? And again, it is, right? So don't hear me saying
yeah,
it's not, but it's like the only topic that they can ever preach on, or that there's always kind of like an anger almost in their voice too, of like,
right,
we should be
right,
taking more seriously this sacrifice, da, 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 da,
right.
and
The good
they're
news
right.
becomes a stick.
Yes, yeah, right. And so it's not that they're wrong, so don't hear that. It's just more of like, they never come back to the laughing and the thinking and the right, the crying, like, all
Mm,
right. And but then there are also people that maybe don't pay enough attention, right? And it's just all worship, it's all joy. And this is forever stuck in my head, but there was this one Walmart cashier in my town that anytime you asked her how she was doing, it's like, "Oh, I'm blessed. How are you?" And it was like the fakest response ever.
mm.
And you just wondered, like, what's really going on under the hood, right? Like, it can't
Yeah,
be that way every single time. And so Jubilee is actually this reminder that forgiveness comes at a cost, and yet can be wedded to jubilation, to Jubilee, can be wedded to this sense of rest and enjoyment and embodiment and at one-ment with
yep,
God.
it's
And
good.
yet we what do we often do? We often just kind of go about our day, and just, sometimes, maybe we'll pray the Lord's Prayer, or read the scripture. But I think this is supposed to be a lasting reminder to the juxtaposition that you noted. And with that, I'll kind of cycle us to our last section here before we close out with our invitations. Is that, and this part pains me for some reason, but there's no recorded history of Israel ever pulling off the year of Jubilee. It's never been pulled off. It's never been. I mean, it's been marked on the calendar, and
Mm,
actually, like, there's a lot of confusion. I tried to find out, like, when's the next year of Jubilee supposed to be. You can actually, like, make a case for it being any year at this point because it's just been so long, and the
we're overdue.
calendars. And, what's that?
We're overdue.
Sure are, right? And so in being overdue, how can I celebrate this juxtaposition? Well, that's where I'll bring us back to the conference you and I went to, Kyle. And we don't have the time to go through the whole of the conference. But do you want to take a stab at summarizing the Jubilee conference before I do?
No, because you're the pro. You do this every year. So how could I
Eh,
begin? I was a mere spectator.
my gosh. Well, one of my favorite memories, not just of you and I, literally one of my favorite memories is you waking me up with a pillow, calling it the tapanta stick. And it was, if you've ever slept in a hotel, it's the long cylindrical pill-shaped pillow that's maybe like 3 feet long or whatever. And it was just you just slamming me and yelling tapanta. And tapanta is the Greek term for all things. And the Jubilee conference that I'm headed off to this very weekend, which is really great. This podcast will come out the day after I get back from the Jubilee conference. This idea of all things being redeemed, all things entering God's rest, all things being impacted by God's forgiveness is the crux of the conference. We walk through the whole of the scripture in 4 parts: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. And we talk about how our salvation, our individual salvation, is supposed to lead to a worldwide participation in God's redemption of all things. Just small things we talk about at this conference. And so for instance, I'm going to be doing a breakout session on being a fan of sports and being an athlete and being a competitor. How can we take that and bring that under, to use this podcast episode's terms, under the somberness and the holiness? How can we consecrate our fandom of sports, our participation in competition, while also bringing about the fruit of the spirit in ways that you don't often see in competition? And so I'm preparing a whole hour and a half breakout session on that. I've been to breakout sessions on meteorology, on technology, on writing, on art, you name it, on music and making music, but also listening to music. You name it, we've discussed how to bring that particular vocation or that major, if you're a college student, under the lordship of Jesus Christ. And so that conference is called the Jubilee Conference partially because we want to recognize that even if the year of Jubilee, this 50th year, has never officially been set aside by an entire people group, we are still called to live into it. We are
Mhm.
still called to live into this somberness of the reality of our need for grace and this rest, this enjoyment that the whole of creation is supposed to experience it. So how do I do that as a math teacher? How do I do that as a salesman? How do I do that as a politician or a scientist? We're supposed to. All of these things matter to God, just like in Leviticus 25, how it's like the whole of creation is being invited into God's rest for this year. And so that kind of leads us right into the invitations, Kyle, unless you have any other thoughts on the conference.
That was a fun conference. It was good to get a nice pillow fight started with the entire crew. We had a good crew that year, that's for
We
sure.
did.
And I think that this going back, this considering all things. I think that there's a huge, to dive into this theme. It's coming back to a biblical way of doing things. If we set aside culture for a moment and we think about, wow, like what would the world look like if insert biblical truth here? And I think I brought this up on some other episodes even, but here it really lays it out time after time. What if debts were released? What if prisoners were set free?
Mm-hmm.
um what if we took time to care for the poor? What if we let our land heal, right? And you could dive in and even think about, they said whenever things shut down for COVID, the hole in the ozone layer started to close back up. And that was just such a small blip on the horizon. Think about
Mm-hmm.
what it would actually look like to allow the earth, our bodies to reset, to heal, to rejuvenate. And then we went out as Christ would and looked around and said, who else needs this restoration? It's
Mhm,
just beautiful.
mhm.
Christianity aside, let's just talk about what this could look like. To me, that's one of the most compelling reasons for my faith. When I look back through and say, you know what? I don't really like this. I don't like having to follow this rule, but man, that's probably going to save a lot of bumps and bruises along the way for a lot of people. And so to me, that's pretty compelling when it comes to a set of guidelines for um, how we should do things. And there's a lot of truth there that my logical brain really likes.
Yeah, that's so well put. One of the analogies I've been sitting on in my own head this whole time that you just reminded me of is when I used to hate running. I was a sprinter, but I was never the like, let's go out and run for a mile. Like I only did that just to help me with my sprints back in high school. And so when I was like 23, 24, starting out life as a bachelor, I was like, I'm just gonna try getting into running. And I didn't know a thing about it. And so I just literally ran every single day, a mile or two, and didn't know you were supposed to regularly take a day off, at least one day off, if not 2 days off a week. So after about, I think it was about 2, 3 months of running literally every single day, because that's all I knew. I thought that's what you were supposed to do. I got Achilles tendonitis in both my Achilles, and
Mm.
it was so bad in the one tendon that you could hear it creak, and not just like me hear it creak. I could sit in a quiet room and be like, "Hey guys," like you could hear my Achilles tendon creaking, and I had to take 4 months off of running. And so the careful lesson I learned was I need to enjoy this and treat it properly, or else I'm just gonna break down.
Right.
And that's part of what Jubilee is all about. And you were alluding to it too, where there's something here where there's something more than just following the rules and trying to like do it perfectly. There's also something else to like, I'm just gonna work my way to the top. Like there was some of that in my running exercise as well. Of like, well, if I'm gonna do this, I'm gonna outwork everyone. I'm just gonna do it every single day. Da, 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 da. But there's also something too, like, well, the work itself matters as well, right? So like I'm
Mhm.
not gonna become better at long distance running by not running either. So there's this careful marriage of like the somberness and sobriety and the holiness around any activity, any job, any vocation, any hobby, any relationship that you have. And there's also a joy. And there's
Mm.
also a rest. There's also an embodiment of what God is
Mm.
like in studying science, in teaching math, in being a salesperson, in being a lobbyist, in being a whatever, right? Campus minister. It doesn't matter. And it would do us well to pay attention to the lesson of Jubilee and entrust that all things really do matter to God and all things are being redeemed by God.
That's good.
So I'll list out the invitations here, and then if you have any invitations you're thinking of, Kyle, but I wrote down three. One was to experience rest through trusting in God, providing enough for both our work and our rest. Right? There's this sort of like inner rest I think we're supposed to enter into where we trust just as God promised he would provide for this Jubilee year, right? Like there'll be enough. There'll be enough food. Don't pick the fields, just pick the grains that are, from the fields that are growing without your help, that we can rely on God for both the enjoyment of our rest and the fruit of our work. The second invitation I wrote down is to you cannot experience Jubilee alone. It's only Jubilee if it's shared. Right, this whole chapter is speaking to a community of people. Now we read it alone, typically we
Yeah.
typically read it, a chapter in our own devotionals, but it's truly not Jubilee unless it's shared.
Well, that stood out to me actually when thinking through, hey, what would this look like if we entered into this year of Jubilee? And you said, I think playing games, and I was like, man, yeah, like I have so many games that I would love to play with so many people, and you got a pile behind you. I got several stacks throughout the house, and and I had the thought, man, this actually would be pretty rough alone.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there are some introverts and even a decent percentage of my own personality that would be like, sweet, a year off. I'm gonna come down here to my basement and just be by myself without
Right.
having to
Right.
worry about bills or whatever. It
Right.
wouldn't last long. And the idea isn't that I just get to rest. The idea is the whole community gets to rest. Right? Cousin Joe, who's been over there with Hosea, comes back to the family and enjoys all of this with us without the burden of debt, without the burden of where the next meal is going to come from. Yeah, it's not Jubilee unless it's shared.
Yep.
And then the final invitation that I have before our benediction, or any invitations you've thought of, Kyle, is we work out our salvation and our forgiveness in a way that actually matters to others. It can be really easy to hear the gospel message on a Sunday morning and to think about how Jesus loves me and how to, right? Like, and to share the gospel in that sort of way too, where like Jesus loves you. And it's true, but it's not complete unless it makes a communal impact. And sometimes I really fear. Well, actually, here's a quote that embodies my fear. The most segregated day of the week is Sunday morning. We find ourselves enclosed in four walls on denominational lines, on ethnic lines, on all sorts of communal lines, and even like boundary lines of counties and cities and stuff. The most segregated day of the week is still Sunday. And there's something about the way that our forgiveness is supposed to be worked out, that's worked out in community and it's worked out in a way that benefits others and brings fruit to others. The second breakout session that I'll be leading at Jubilee is going to be on servant leadership. And so I'll be talking about like, how do we as leaders actually truly benefit others and not just, become leaders like the world sees leaders.
Mhm.
So yeah, any thoughts on that invitation or any other invitations you can think of, Kyle?
I think my only invitation would be around that idea of Sabbath that we didn't dive fully into, but it was certainly touched on. And I think it's just, sitting and reflecting and be invited to explore what that could look like for you, if it's just you and for you and your family, if you're in that, chapter of life. And I think that, again, start small, but there's a lot of fruit there because this idea of a reset, you can't reset your computer while you're still typing emails. You got to stop, you got to shut it
Yeah.
down. And it's the same thing here. You need to get a little bit of quiet. And I invite you to explore that with yourself and your friends and family.
Yeah, well put, Kyle. Yeah, the practice of a Sabbath day, or even if you can't fathom putting aside a whole day, like try an evening or try even just an hour or two where you say, I'm going to set aside this whole time, no phone, nothing, nothing that feels like work, basically, right? Whether that's work you get paid for, or I know like a lot of parents like doing the laundry and making meals is work. So
Sure.
put an hour aside and order in Domino's, or,
Oh,
like seriously, like whatever it takes to really set aside that time from feeling like work, just to trust that the Lord really does provide. And I'll attach that if you're listening to this episode when it drops, a week and a half from now is Ash Wednesday and the beginning of Lent. And if you've never given up something for Lent,
mm,
that would also be a good practice as well for this Sabbath of recognizing, like, I don't, well, I'm planning on doing a social media fast during Lent this year. And so, I don't need this. I can set this aside to make just a little bit more space for trusting that God can provide whatever dopamine effect social media is having in my brain. Like that can
good.
provide something more than what my doom scrolling is providing for me. So I would encourage you, the listener, as well, if you're listening to this chronologically in the same time that we're dropping it, to consider 2 Wednesdays from now on March 5th what you can give up for the next 40 days leading up to Easter. Any other thoughts, Kyle, before I give our benediction?
Take us away.
All right. Well, may you experience Jubilee by giving it away in all that you do and all that you are. Thanks for listening to the Invitation Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, kindly invite others, see what I did there, Kyle, to listen in by sharing it with a friend, posting about it on social media, or even leaving a rating and a review.
To catch all the latest and greatest, give us a follow on Instagram, Facebook, or X at The Invitation Pod, and help us share the invitation with others. Thanks again. We hope you'll tune in to future episodes.